The sun had barely dipped behind the jagged mountains when Jackson McCade rode into Red Hollow, his dusty boots scraping the parched earth. What was once a thriving town now smelled of abandonment. Only the wind and the whispers of forgotten lives remained. The town, where streets had once echoed with the sounds of horse hooves and bustling folk, had been reduced to hushed reverence for its own demise. Jackson's horse snorted, its breath curling into the cold evening air as they passed decaying storefronts and homes left to the mercy of time. He wasn't here for the town, nor its crumbling buildings. He was here for something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The wagon wheel creaked loudly, carrying Jackson through the empty streets, the soft sway of his horse a reminder of his solitude. The soft glow of lanterns in the distance revealed a gathering of people. There was an odd energy hanging over the town square like a storm waiting to break. And then he saw it, the auction block. The auctioneer, a lanky man with a sharp jaw and crooked teeth, bellowed orders as townsfolk milled about in half-empty rows, their eyes heavy with disinterest. And there she was, Clara Belle Thornton. Her head was held high, though the weight of her circumstances pressed down on her shoulders, her face weathered by more years than a woman ought to bear. Her dress clung to her frame like wet cloth, soaked through with the heavy rain that had been falling off and on since morning. She stood alone, her sons Wesley, Luke, James, Eli, and little Zach gathered around her like broken fence posts, silent, watchful, and waiting for something they didn't understand. Jackson felt something stir inside him, a strange sense of recognition in her stance. The woman wasn't afraid. No, she wasn't afraid of being auctioned off or sold. It was the kind of fear that came from something deeper, something untold, buried beneath the surface of survival. He had seen that kind of look in the eyes of men who had lost everything, the kind of look that haunted you at night and turned your bones to ice. The auctioneer's voice sliced through the air. Lot 11, a widow and her 5 boys, all healthy, strong backs, all ready for work. He turned toward Clara Belle, a sneer on his lips. She ain't much for labor. But the boys. He left the sentence dangling, his eyes sweeping over her like a predator eyeing its prey. Jackson could feel the murmurs ripple through the crowd. A few snickers, a couple of low laughs. It was the usual reaction. When a woman like Clara Belle ended up on the auction block, it wasn't because of her strength. It was because she was desperate, a widow, with nothing but her children to barter, to sell. And Jackson could see that desperation, the flicker of fear in her eyes when the auctioneer's hand pointed toward her. He hadn't planned on stopping, hadn't planned on being part of this at all. He had cattle to sell, a ranch to tend to, a past that wouldn't leave him alone. But something about the sight of her, about the way her eyes held steady in the face of all the judgments being cast upon her, pulled him in. "They're not pups," Jackson said, his voice low and steady. The auctioneer sneered. "No," the man replied. "Pups fetch better prices." The crowd shifted uneasily as the rain began to fall harder, a cold, biting wind sweeping through the square. People scattered to find shelter under the sparse awnings that lined the square. But Clara Belle didn't move. She stood there, her arms around the smallest boy, holding him close as the others clung to her skirts like frightened birds. Jackson didn't know why he had come, but guilt and something unfinished in his life had pulled him here. And maybe, just maybe, it was because of the woman who stood tall, despite everything life had stolen from her. He swung off his horse before he even knew what he was doing, his boots splashing in the mud as he crossed the square. He shoved past people who eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain until he stood directly in front of Clara Bell. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. But there was something in the air between them, a silence that said more than words ever could. "What's your name?" he asked her. She studied him carefully, as though she had heard that question 1,000 times and didn't care to answer it. But after a long pause, she spoke, her voice steady but low. "Clara Bell Thornton." Jackson nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her name press against him, and his gaze shifted to the 5 boys who stood at her side. Each one of them looked like they had seen too much too soon, their faces hollow with the weight of hardship. "Are these your sons?" he asked. Her jaw tensed. "They're all I have." Jackson didn't answer right away. He could see it then, the weight of all the promises she had made, the burden she carried. A woman like her didn't get to make choices. She was just another piece of the land, another commodity to be passed around. Jackson reached inside his coat, pulled out a wad of bills, and handed them to the auctioneer without breaking eye contact with Clara Bell. Too much for what she was worth, too little for what it really meant. "I'll take them all," he said simply. The crowd erupted in laughter, their mockery a sharp contrast to Clara Bell's stillness. A man spat on the ground, shaking his head. "You marrying her, too." "McCade." Jackson didn't respond. Clara Bell didn't either. She simply looked down at her sons, all of them wide-eyed and uncertain. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, her youngest child still clutched to her hip, the others following her like shadows behind her. Jackson led them to his wagon, the rain coming down harder now, each drop feeling like a hammer strike against his resolve. The cold wind cut through his coat as he motioned for Clara Bell to climb aboard. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the wagon, her boots sinking into the mud as she took a seat. The boys followed, each one hesitating at first, but eventually finding their place, their faces reflecting the uncertainty that clouded the air between them. They didn't speak again until they were well outside of town. The sound of the rain against the wagon, a constant hum in the background. Clara Bell didn't look at Jackson, but her voice broke the silence. "You didn't ask what I'm worth." "I don't care," Jackson answered. She fell silent again. The only sound the steady creaking of the wagon as it rolled through the darkening landscape. The boy in her arms had fallen asleep, his small body limp against her chest, the others looking out into the distance, unsure of what would come next. As the night drew on, the faint glow of Jackson's ranch came into view. A dilapidated place, just like the town they had left behind. But it was theirs now, for better or worse. Jackson stopped the wagon in front of the barn. "You can sleep in the house," he said. "I'll bunk in the barn." Clara Bell didn't thank him. Instead, she just nodded. "I won't owe you," she said quietly. "You paid." "I did." Jackson gave a short nod and turned away, his heart heavy in his chest. The moon, barely visible through the clouds, cast a pale light over the barren landscape as Clara Bell walked inside the house with her boys. The night was far from over, but for now, it felt like the beginning of something he had long been running from. As Jackson stood by the barn, the wind picked up again, whistling through the cracks in the wood. He watched the shadows lengthen, and for a brief moment, he thought about the life he had lost his wife, his daughter, the family he once had. But now, there was a new family. A family built from silence, from hardship, from the kind of things you didn't speak about but carried with you nonetheless. Tomorrow would come with its own troubles. But for now, he let the wind take the pain. He let it whisper the truths he had long tried to ignore. And as he stood there, waiting for sleep, he heard the soft murmur of Clara Belle's voice inside the house. She was speaking to her sons, trying to comfort them. Jackson still didn't know if he had bought them to save them or to save himself, but he knew one thing for certain: he could never have walked away. Tomorrow, they would all have to face what came next, but for now, there was just the sound of the rain and a new family trying to find its place in the world. As Jackson leads Clara Belle and her sons to his wagon, the cold wind picks up, howling through the town as if to warn him. The boys, eyes wide with uncertainty, follow silently behind. The oldest boy, Wesley, lingers at the back, studying Jackson. What kind of man buys a family like that? The wagon creaked along the rugged path, the wheels sinking slightly into the mud. The storm had come faster than anyone had expected, and Jackson McCade was starting to feel the weight of his decision. What had he gotten himself into? The wind whipped the rain sideways, the cold biting into his skin despite the thick layers of his coat. He wasn't accustomed to such torrential downpours. But the West had a way of testing a man's patience, his resolve. And this was testing Jackson. He barely remembered what had driven him into Red Hollow in the first place, but it felt like fate had stepped in and pulled him by the reins to something bigger, something that had been waiting for him, hidden beneath layers of guilt and regret. The dim light from the lanterns in the wagon flickered erratically, casting shadows on Clara Belle's face as she sat with her 5 boys, all bundled together under a single blanket. The youngest, Zach, was already asleep in her arms, his small form breathing evenly against her chest. The other boys were more awake, their faces drawn and tight, as though they too were carrying something too heavy to bear. Jackson glanced over at the boy riding beside him on the wagon's bench. Wesley, the oldest, kept his eyes forward, hands clenched tight around the leather reins. The only sound between them the muffled rhythm of hooves and the occasional grunt of the horses. Wesley's silence was a heavy one, the kind that weighed on the air. Jackson didn't push him to speak. He knew the boy didn't trust him. There was no reason to. Jackson didn't trust himself, either. He had only come to the auction with a mind to sell cattle. But somewhere between the long stretch of road and the desolate town, something in him had shifted, and before he knew it, he had bought a family. The rain started to let up slightly, but the damp earth beneath them made the journey even more treacherous. They were making their way to the ranch, a place Jackson had called home, but it was a lonely place. To just him, the wind, and the past that clung to him like a second skin. He didn't know how to explain it, but when he saw Clara Belle standing at the auction, something stirred in him, something forgotten. Maybe it was pity, maybe something else, but the fact remained that she and her sons now belonged to him, whether he liked it or not. A thought flickered in the back of his mind, one that had been haunting him since the auction. What kind of man buys a family like that? The thought lingered, unanswered. He stole a glance at Wesley, who was still staring ahead, eyes sharp and suspicious. The boy had been quiet since they left Red Hollow, but Jackson could feel the weight of his gaze, even if it was never directed at him. It was the kind of look that spoke of distrust, of anger, of a world that had given up on him before he ever had the chance to stand on his own. It was a look Jackson knew all too well. The wagon creaked again as they bounced over a particularly deep rut, and Jackson was jolted from his thoughts. The land here was unforgiving, an endless stretch of brown earth and scattered rock, with only the occasional stunted tree to break up the monotony. The wind was biting now, cutting through the layers of their clothing. But Jackson kept moving forward. There was no turning back. Not now. Ahead. The ranch loomed a solitary figure against the vast expanse of the plains. It wasn't much to look at. The house was small, with a sagging roof, and the barn stood crooked, as though it were about to collapse under the weight of time. Jackson's ranch had always been a place of solitude, a place where he could hide from everything he'd lost. Now, it was going to become a home, a place that would need to be more than just a roof over their heads. Jackson slowed the wagon as they reached the end of the long stretch of road, where the land began to flatten out, revealing a small clearing. The ranch was nestled in the distance, the faint glow from a single lantern in the window offering the only sign of life. Clara Belle stirred slightly, her face still tense from the journey. She glanced at Jackson, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "You didn't ask what we're worth," she said. Her voice steady but low. Jackson shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to answer. "I don't care about that," he muttered, his gaze flicking to her sons. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jackson thought she might say something else, something sharp. Perhaps, but she didn't. Instead, she looked away, her gaze drifting to the land surrounding them, her eyes distant. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. It was the kind of silence Jackson was used to, the kind that made a man think more than he wanted to. He didn't know why he had acted on impulse, why he had bought them at all. Maybe it was pity, maybe it was loneliness, or maybe, just maybe, it was because Clara Belle Thornton and her boys had reminded him of something he had forgotten. As the wagon rolled on, the night deepened around them, the land quiet except for the sound of the rain starting to fall again. But this time, it wasn't as harsh. The storm seemed to be easing, and the promise of dawn was somewhere on the horizon, though it still felt a long way off. When they finally reached the ranch, Jackson unhooked the reins and led the horses into the barn. The place creaked as they walked inside, the low hum of the wind outside filling the space with an eerie sense of emptiness. Clara Belle followed, Zach still asleep in her arms, her other children trailing behind her. Jackson stopped in front of the barn door, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. He turned to Clara Belle, who had set her youngest down on a pile of hay in the corner. Her sons were gathered around her, their faces tired but curious, as though they weren't sure what to make of the place yet. "This is where you'll stay," Jackson said, his voice low, his words slipping into the silence. He wasn't sure what else to say. The ranch wasn't much, but it was theirs, for better or worse. Clara Belle nodded, her face unreadable. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The truth hung between them like a fog, a truth neither of them had the courage to face just yet. "Can you handle this?" Jackson asked, his voice softer now, almost uncertain. The question hung in the air, heavy and vulnerable. Clara Belle didn't look at him. "I'll handle it." She walked away, leading her boys deeper into the barn. The creak of the wooden floorboards echoed in the stillness, but Jackson couldn't bring himself to follow them just yet. He stood there for a long moment, staring into the darkness of the barn, his mind swirling with questions. Had he done the right thing? Could a man like him ever do anything right? And then, before he could answer, a voice broke through the silence. "Are you going to make her work, too?" It was Wesley, standing at the door of the barn. His eyes narrowed, the tension in his shoulders betraying his suspicion. Jackson turned slowly, meeting the boy's gaze. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Wesley said, his voice hard. "You bought us. But we ain't livestock. Not like you think." Jackson's chest tightened, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. But before he could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Clara Bell appeared in the doorway, her eyes sharp, her jaw set. She didn't speak, but Jackson could see it then, the battle in her eyes, the fight to protect what was left of her family. And he realized, in that instant, that he wasn't just holding on to them. They were holding on to him, too. Before Jackson could answer, Wesley. The wind howled again, louder this time, and something shifted in the distance, like a shadow moving just beyond the edge of the light. "What was that?" Clara Bell asked, her voice low, scanning the darkening landscape. Jackson's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung over his shoulder. In the growing silence, a horse neighed sharply from the far fence, and then a man's silhouette appeared, watching them from the ridge. The morning sun struggled to break through the thick clouds, casting a pale light over the landscape. The storm had passed, but its remnants hung heavy in the air. In the quiet, Jackson McCade could hear the boys laughing softly, a sound he hadn't heard in years. It was the kind of laughter that didn't come from happiness, but from relief. The storm had passed, the weight of their journey finally lifting, if only for a moment. As Jackson sat on the porch of the small house, sipping from a chipped cup, he watched the boys at work, each of them finding their place in the sprawling emptiness of the ranch. It was still early, but already, the world seemed a little more settled, a little quieter. The morning fog had lifted, but the ground was soft and wet, the mud sticking to boots and hooves alike. The ranch, with its dilapidated barn and crooked fence posts, seemed to breathe with a life of its own, shaped by the people who inhabited it, even if they were few. Jackson leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet settle over him like a blanket, but his mind was elsewhere. His eyes tracked Wesley as the boy worked to clear the scattered debris around the barn, the boy's movements purposeful, though there was something tense in the way he carried himself. Jackson knew Wesley didn't trust him, and it gnawed at him, though he couldn't bring himself to change it. Trust was something that couldn't be earned in a day. Jackson had come into their lives without asking, without explanation. The scars of his own past weighed too heavily for him to offer them much comfort. Clara Bell came out of the house, the soft sway of her skirt brushing against the wooden steps. She held herself tall, a woman carved by survival. Jackson didn't speak, but watched her as she crossed the yard, her movements fluid, but there was a tiredness in the way she moved, something worn, something deeper than just exhaustion from the journey. She walked toward the barn, but paused when she reached Jackson, her gaze never meeting his. "They're settling in," she said, her voice steady but low, like a woman still unsure if she could trust the ground beneath her feet. "Wesley's more of a help than he lets on." Jackson nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Good. They need to get their hands dirty." Clara Bell shifted on her feet, her eyes following the boys in the yard. But she was somewhere else, lost in thought. Her silence spoke more than any words could. Jackson didn't know what to say to her. He couldn't tell if she hated him for bringing them here, or if she was just too tired to feel anything at all. The space between them, once filled with questions and quiet judgments, seemed to grow, and Jackson wondered if it would ever close. "You've been quiet since we got here," Clara Bell said suddenly, her voice cutting through the stillness. "I'm not asking for answers, but I need to know where you stand." Jackson turned his gaze to her, feeling the weight of her words settle in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't lie to her. Not anymore. "I'm here, Clara Bell," he said, his voice low, unsure. "I'm not leaving." She looked at him, and for the first time since they had met, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something soft, almost human. But it was fleeting, gone before he could fully grasp it. She nodded, though her expression remained unreadable. "I'll hold you to that." McCade. The words hung between them, unsaid, but understood. And then, without another word, she turned and made her way toward the barn, her boots making a soft echo against the damp earth. Jackson's gaze lingered on her figure as she disappeared inside. The moment passed, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts. Wesley's laugh interrupted the stillness again, sharper this time, followed by the sounds of the other boys joining in. Jackson stood from his chair, the creak of his knees matching the groan of the old wood beneath him. He stretched, trying to shake off the heaviness that had been pressing against him since the moment he had set foot in Red Hollow. As he walked toward the barn, his thoughts were a mixture of guilt and determination. He hadn't planned for any of this. He had come to town with cattle, with nothing more than an aimless purpose. But now, Clara Bell and her boys were his responsibility. They were his family, whether he was ready or not. He reached the barn and saw Wesley standing near the back, looking up at the sagging roof as if trying to figure out where to start. The boy had a sharpness in his eyes that reminded Jackson of himself at that age. Angry, distrustful, carrying the weight of things he didn't yet understand. "Need help?" Jackson asked, his voice gruff, though there was no real intention to push the boy into conversation. Wesley didn't answer immediately, his eyes flicking toward Jackson before he gave a slight nod. "Could use it," he muttered, his voice heavy with hesitation. "Not much to work with." Jackson stepped forward, his boots sinking into the soft ground as he reached for a handful of tools nearby. He handed Wesley a hammer, feeling the boy's gaze on him as if trying to figure out whether he was worthy of trust. Jackson didn't know what to do with that, so he simply stayed silent, working alongside the boy as the day stretched on. It wasn't much a few boards to replace, some nails to drive in, but the quiet moments between them spoke louder than words. And in that silence, Jackson began to understand. It wasn't about fixing the barn or making the ranch look presentable. It was about building something that had been long lost: trust, family, a future. Clara Bell appeared again, her presence as steady as the land beneath their feet. She had the same determined look on her face, though there was something in her eyes that Jackson couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and resentment. She didn't speak at first, but Jackson could see her watching them from the doorway. Wesley glanced at her, then back at Jackson, his hand slowing for just a moment before he resumed working. There was a strange understanding between the two, unspoken but real. The boys were slowly becoming part of this place, part of Jackson's world. It was then that Jackson noticed something in the distance. A figure was moving across the far side of the ranch, walking toward them with deliberate slowness. It was a man tall, broad-shouldered, with a coat that flapped against the wind like it was made of old leather. Jackson squinted, recognizing him from the few dealings he had had in town. It was Sheriff Dawson Granger. The man's steps were slow but purposeful, like he had all the time in the world to get to where he was going. Jackson felt his stomach tighten. "Think we've got company," Jackson muttered to Wesley, who had already started to glance over his shoulder. Wesley didn't say anything, but his shoulders stiffened as the figure drew nearer. Jackson's heart raced. There had been whispers when they had first arrived. The sheriff was the law in this place, unwavering, impartial, and loyal to the town's interests. And the townsfolk had their suspicions about Jackson, especially now that he had taken in Clara Bell and her boys. Jackson knew what was coming. Granger wasn't here to offer friendly advice. He was here to see what Jackson was willing to do. And Jackson had a sinking feeling that this would not be the last time they would have to face the sheriff. Sheriff Dawson Granger reached the edge of the barn, his gaze sharp and focused. Without a word, he tipped his hat back, and Jackson could see the quiet authority in his eyes. "Got something to say?" "McCade," Granger said, his voice low. "And you might not like it." The sun hung low over Red Hollow, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. Jackson McCade stood at the edge of the town, knowing that the law, much like the town itself, had a way of creeping up on you when you least expected it. The wind was picking up again, kicking dust through the narrow streets, leaving a trail of sand in its wake. The world felt dry here, arid and worn down, like everything had been drained to the bone. Jackson stood there, waiting, his hand resting on the brim of his hat, trying to ignore the tension gnawing at his insides. He had come here with cattle, looking for a deal, but now, standing in the town square, he was waiting for something much heavier. The weight of the town's eyes were on him, just like they'd been since he stepped into Red Hollow. The people had their doubts about him, about his past, and about what he had done by taking Clara Bell and her children in. Jackson wasn't stupid. He knew that there were whispers behind closed doors. He could feel it in the way the sheriff had eyed him when they first met, in the coldness of the auctioneer's voice, in the way the townsfolk had shifted uneasily when he made the decision to buy the Thornton family. It wasn't the first time in his life that he'd been misunderstood. In fact, it had become a familiar feeling, one that had burrowed deep into his bones. But today, as he stared down the quiet street, he knew that it was only just beginning. His past was coming for him, whether he was ready or not. The sheriff had sent word that he wanted to meet nothing official, just a friendly conversation, which Jackson knew was code for a warning. He had been down this road before, dealing with men like Sheriff Granger, men who liked to pretend they were impartial, but who had allegiances deeper than the law itself. Jackson tipped his hat back and walked toward the sheriff's office, his boots kicking up dust with every step. The door was propped open, and Jackson could hear the sound of voices inside, low murmurs that died as he approached. He paused at the threshold, feeling the eyes of the office fall on him, before stepping inside. Sheriff Granger was sitting behind his desk, his boots up on the corner, leaning back in his chair with his hands folded across his belly. There was a glass of whiskey beside him, the amber liquid catching the weak light from the window. "McCade," the sheriff said, his voice gravelly. "Glad you could make it. Have a seat." Jackson hesitated but sat across from the sheriff, his body tense, ready for whatever Granger had in mind. He could tell the sheriff wasn't here to make friends. No. This was something else. This was a power play. "You've been quiet," Granger said after a long pause, eyeing Jackson carefully. "Town doesn't know what to make of you yet, and I reckon Clara Bell Thornton doesn't know what to make of you either." Jackson's jaw tightened at the mention of Clara Bell. "What's that supposed to mean?" The sheriff chuckled, his lips curling in a faint smile. "It means, McCade, that there's a lot of talk about what you're doing. You're stirring things up here, and when that happens, people get nervous." Jackson leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping against the wooden table. I'm just trying to give them a place to stay. Granger's gaze sharpened. And you think that's enough? You think just buying her and her boys at an auction is going to make you their savior? I'm not looking to be anyone's savior, Jackson replied, his voice low. I'm looking to do what's right. The sheriff's smile faded. That's where you're wrong. McCade. You see, what's right and what's legal don't always line up in a place like this. You're playing a dangerous game, and it won't be long before people start asking questions. Jackson's fingers curled into a fist, but he didn't say anything. He knew the sheriff was baiting him, pushing him to break. But he wasn't going to rise to the occasion. Not yet. I didn't ask for this, Jackson said after a moment, his voice strained. But now that I'm in it, I'm not backing down. Granger watched him closely, his eyes narrowing. You might not have asked for it, but you've made yourself part of the story. And once you're part of the story in Red Hollow, there's no getting out. Jackson's stomach turned, and for a moment, he regretted ever stepping into this town. But it was too late for that. He had already made his choice, and now it was about surviving it. The sheriff took a slow drink from his glass, savoring it before setting it down with a quiet clink. You need to understand something. McCade. People here don't forget. They don't forget who you are, where you've come from, and what you've done. They've seen enough men like you come and go to know how this plays out. Jackson stared at him, his face impassive. And what do you want from me? Granger leaned in, his eyes cold. I want you to know your place. You don't belong here. You never have, and you never will. So, don't get too comfortable. Jackson stood, his chair scraping against the floor with a loud screech. He had heard enough. The sheriff had made it clear that he didn't belong in Red Hollow, but Jackson wasn't about to run. Not now. Not when he had made a promise. He had come to town for one thing, and he was going to see it through. Good talk, Jackson muttered, turning on his heel and walking toward the door. He paused just as he reached the threshold. You should keep an eye on your own. Sheriff, it's not just me you need to worry about. Granger didn't respond, but Jackson could feel the weight of the sheriff's eyes on his back as he stepped outside. The door slammed shut behind him, the echo of it ringing in his ears. Jackson walked down the street, the weight of Granger's words settling heavily in his chest. He knew the sheriff wasn't finished with him, and that the tension in Red Hollow was only going to rise. But what bothered him most wasn't the sheriff. It was the way the town was beginning to turn its eyes on him, like vultures waiting for a sign of weakness. He didn't look back as he made his way to the ranch. He couldn't afford to. He had too much at stake. By the time he reached the ranch, the sky was dark, and a chill had settled in the air. He could hear the sound of the boys in the barn, their laughter quieter now, but still present. The warmth of the fire inside the house beckoned, but Jackson didn't feel like going in. Not yet. He paused by the barn door, watching the last sliver of light fade over the horizon. He had come to the west to escape, but now, it seemed, the west was coming for him. Before Jackson could step inside, he heard a rustling sound behind him. He turned just in time to see a figure moving in the shadows. McCade, the voice called out, low and familiar. We need to talk. The wind had kicked up again, swirling dust through the ranch like an omen. Jackson McCade stood by the barn, his thoughts clouded as he stared at the horizon, wondering if the battle they were facing was worth the price they might have to pay. The day had been quiet. Too quiet, and Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the horizon. He didn't know whether it was the relentless wind or the shadows of his own past creeping up behind him. but the weight of the uncertainty felt like a storm waiting to break. He could hear the faint sounds of the boys inside the barn, their voices soft and uncertain, as though they, too, were trying to find something they had lost. Jackson had spent the better part of the day repairing a broken fence, the repetitive work offering him no relief, just the steady rhythm of his hands and the occasional glance over his shoulder. He had to admit that things were settling into a routine. Clara Bell had already begun working the land as if it had always been hers. Her sons had started helping around the ranch, and there was a tentative peace between them, a truce held together by silence and the unspoken understanding that they had no other choice. But that silence, Jackson knew, was just a temporary balm. He couldn't ignore the tension that hung in the air between him and Clara Bell, nor could he deny the strain between him and the boys. Wesley, in particular, had barely spoken a word to him since they arrived. The boy was a fortress, closed off, watching Jackson like he was some sort of threat. Jackson couldn't blame him, but it hurt just the same. As the sun began to set, the chill in the air intensified. Jackson rubbed his hands together, hoping to ward off the cold, when he saw Clara Bell walking toward him. Her movements were purposeful, but there was something about the way she walked that gave away her unease. She wasn't quite looking at him, but she wasn't avoiding him either. Jackson met her halfway, standing still as she came closer. She didn't stop immediately, but her pace slowed when she reached him. The silence between them stretched long, too long. Finally, she spoke. "You've been quiet today," she said, her voice low, just above a whisper. There was a hint of something in her tone, something that Jackson couldn't quite place. "I've had a lot on my mind," he replied, his voice gruff. Clara Bell nodded, but the movement was stiff, as if she were holding back words she couldn't bring herself to say. She was standing so close now that Jackson could feel the heat of her body, could smell the faint trace of earth and leather that clung to her clothes. "I don't know what you want from me, McCade," she said finally, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "I don't know if you're doing this out of guilt or something else, but I need to know. I need to know where you stand." Her words hit him like a sudden gust of wind. The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unforgiving. Jackson felt his heart stutter, his chest tightening at the realization of what she was really asking. She wasn't asking him for his help. She wasn't asking him for charity. She was asking him to take responsibility. She was asking him to acknowledge that he wasn't just a stranger who had come to their rescue. He was part of their lives now, whether he wanted to be or not. "I'm here," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I'm not going anywhere." Clara Bell stared at him for a long moment, and Jackson could see the hesitation in her eyes. It was a hesitation he knew well. Fear, uncertainty, distrust. She wasn't sure if she could believe him, and he couldn't blame her. What did she really know about him? Nothing, other than that he had bought them like cattle at an auction. Nothing, except that he had come into their lives in the same way a storm might come, sudden, violent, and without warning. "I'm not asking for promises," she said, her voice barely audible. "I just need to know what this is, what you want from us." Jackson swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to say something, wanted to explain everything, but the words wouldn't come. He had never been good with words, and the truth, the real truth, felt too raw to share. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I don't know what I want, but I'm not walking away." Clarabelle's expression softened just slightly, though there was still a wariness in her gaze. She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, her face unreadable. Finally, she nodded, and Jackson could see the weight lift from her shoulders. Just a little. "All right," she said simply. "We'll see." Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the house, her steps lighter than before, but still carrying the weight of everything that had come before. Jackson watched her go, his heart heavy with the knowledge that things weren't going to be easy, that the road ahead was long, and that redemption wasn't something you could find in a single day. The sun dipped lower, casting the ranch in shadow, and Jackson remained standing there, the weight of his own silence pressing down on him. He had never been a man who sought answers, who sought redemption. But in that moment, as the night crept in around him, he realized that he was seeking something he had lost a long time ago. And whether he liked it or not, Clarabelle Thornton and her sons were now part of that journey. The next few hours passed in uneasy quiet, with the only sound being the distant calls of the boys as they finished their chores. Jackson didn't go inside. Instead, he found himself walking the perimeter of the ranch, his thoughts drifting as he looked out over the land. The wind had picked up again, and the night was cold, but Jackson barely noticed the chill. His mind was elsewhere, caught between the weight of the choices he had made and the uncertain future ahead. Just as he turned toward the barn, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He stopped, turning slowly, his eyes catching the dim light of the lantern as it swayed in the breeze. It was Wesley. The boy stood a few paces away, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He said nothing at first, just watched Jackson, his eyes unreadable. There was a tension in the air, a quiet standoff that neither of them knew how to break. Finally, Wesley spoke, his voice low but firm. "You said you wouldn't walk away," he said, his words carrying a weight that Jackson didn't expect. "But I need to know if that's true. I need to know if you're really here for us, or if this is just some game to you." Jackson didn't answer right away. He felt the boy's gaze on him, sharp and unwavering, and for a moment, he was back in that same place he had been before, standing at a crossroads, unsure of which way to turn. But he had made a choice, and now he had to stand by it. "I'm here," Jackson said, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere. Not now." Wesley studied him for a long moment, then gave a short nod, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Jackson standing there, alone with the wind. As Jackson turned toward the barn, he heard the faint sound of a wagon wheel creaking in the distance. His hand instinctively went to the rifle slung over his shoulder, his heart racing. Someone was coming, someone who wasn't welcome. The courtroom doors opened with a groan, the air thick with tension. Jackson McCade walked through the threshold, his heart heavy, knowing that today would decide the future of the Thornton family. The dusty light filtering in through the high, narrow windows made the room feel smaller than it was, the air stale with the scent of wood and parchment. The worn wooden pews, filled with the town's curious and unsympathetic, lined the edges of the room. Jackson took his seat, feeling the weight of the eyes that followed him, some filled with disdain, others with pity. The judge, an older man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, sat high on his bench, his gavel resting silently in front of him. Beside him sat Cyrus Mercer, the lawyer representing Harlan Beckett, a man who had never hidden his disdain for anyone who didn't belong in Red Hollow. Clarabelle sat beside Jackson, her face still but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had dressed in her best, though there was nothing glamorous about it, just a faded dress and a pair of worn boots. Her hair pulled back tightly, her expression one of quiet strength. Jackson could feel the tightness in her shoulders, the tension that mirrored his own. Behind them, her 5 boys sat stiffly, the older ones keeping watch over the younger ones. Wesley, ever the protector, sat in the front, his gaze hard, his jaw clenched, like a man who had already made up his mind about what was to come. Jackson didn't know why he was here. He had come to the West to escape the echoes of his past, to find solitude and peace. But here he was, sitting in this God-forsaken courthouse, facing a battle that was bigger than him, bigger than any man. It wasn't just about ownership or possession. It was about family, about truth, about fighting for what you believed in when the world tried to tear it all away. The judge banged his gavel once, the sound snapping Jackson from his thoughts. The room fell silent, and the tension in the air grew thicker, like a storm that was ready to break. "Mr. McCade," the judge said, his voice dry and rasping. "You stand before this court because Mr. Harlan Beckett has filed a petition questioning your right to keep these children under your care. The claim is that you have no legal guardianship and that the boys should be placed with a family more suitable." He glanced briefly at Clara Bell, then back at Jackson. "This court must decide whether your actions are in the children's best interests, or whether they should be removed from your custody." Jackson felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't a simple matter of buying cattle at an auction or striking a deal. This was a fight for Clara Bell and her boys, for a future that was as fragile as the wind that blew across the plains. Beside him, Clara Bell sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the judge, but her expression was unreadable. There was no fear in her, not now. The only thing that remained was a quiet determination. Mercer stood then, his suit sharp and dark against the pale wood of the courtroom. He was a tall man, with a well-groomed mustache and eyes that never seemed to blink. He looked at Jackson with a cold smile, like a predator preparing for the kill. "Your Honor," Mercer said, his voice smooth and controlled. "The facts of this case are simple. McCade took these children from that auction without proper guardianship papers. My client, Mr. Harlan Beckett, is willing to provide them with a stable home. While McCade is nothing but a rancher with a questionable past, we must consider what is best for the children, not some misplaced sense of charity." Jackson's chest tightened at the words. There it was, the accusation that had been hanging over him since the moment he had decided to take the Thornton family in. He had known they would try to break him down. But hearing it from Mercer, in this place where the stakes were so high, made it feel real. It made it feel like the world was truly against them. He glanced over at Clara Bell, who didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of being affected by Mercer's words. She sat still, her gaze locked forward, as though she was waiting for something, for a moment to rise above all of this. The judge, unimpressed with Mercer's speech, waved his hand dismissively. "We know the case. Mr. Mercer, you've made your point. Let us hear from the other side." Clara Bell stood then, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she was preparing for a battle of her own. The room seemed to grow quieter as she took her place at the witness stand. Jackson couldn't help but admire her strength. She was a woman who had lost so much, who had fought so hard, and yet she stood here, ready to face whatever came her way. Mercer wasted no time, stepping forward with a smug look on his face. "Mrs. Thornton," he began, his tone dripping with false politeness. You claim that your marriage to Mr. McCade is legitimate, but we all know the truth. You were bought, sold, treated like cattle, and yet you stand here, trying to convince this court that your bond is real. Clara Bell didn't flinch, didn't look away. Her voice was steady, firm, as she spoke. I don't care what anyone says, she said, her words cutting through the room like a knife. I don't care about the legality of it. I don't care about what this court thinks. What matters is my children. What matters is that they're safe, that they're together. I'm not here to play games, Mr. Mercer. I'm here to protect my family. Jackson's heart swelled at her words, and he could see the faintest flicker of something in the eyes of the jury. They were listening. They were starting to hear the truth. Mercer stepped back, but his expression never changed. And do you expect us to believe that your marriage to McCade is anything more than a formality? A man who buys you at an auction? Stop. Clara Bell interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. I didn't marry him for protection. I didn't marry him because he bought me. I married him because he gave me a choice. He gave me a chance. Jackson felt a wave of emotion hit him, the rawness of the words hitting him like a freight train. He had never wanted this. He had never wanted to be a part of something so complicated, so full of pain. But Clara Bell had been right. He had given her a choice. And now, it felt like something deeper was beginning to grow between them. Something real. The judge, who had been silent through the exchange, finally spoke. Enough, he said, his voice sharp. I have heard enough of this nonsense. We will proceed with the ruling. The courtroom held its breath as the judge stood, his gavel in hand. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. The moment of truth was upon them. You, the judge began, his eyes fixed on Jackson, may not have proper legal guardianship. Mr. McCade, but one thing is clear. These children are safer with you than anywhere else. Still, the matter is not closed. Until proper papers are filed, this court will keep the guardianship under review. Jackson braced himself for the next words, his palms sweating. The court finds that you have failed to properly file the necessary documents for the marriage. The guardianship of the children is under review. Clara Bell's face tightened, but she didn't break. Jackson reached out, placing his hand on her arm. We'll fight this, he said quietly. The judge stood then, banging his gavel one final time. This case is not closed, but for now, you may go. We'll reconvene once the documents are in order. You are dismissed. As Jackson turned to leave, his heart heavy with uncertainty. He couldn't shake the feeling that this battle was far from over. There would be more fights ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But for now, they had won this round. As Jackson and Clara Bell made their way out of the courtroom, Harlan Beckett blocked their path, his cruel smile sharp as a knife. This isn't over, McCade, he sneered. Not by a long shot. Before Jackson could respond, Beckett leaned in closer, whispering so only he could hear. You might want to check your barn. Tonight things have a way of catching fire out here. Jackson grabbed Beckett's arm, his voice low but cold. If you come near my land, Beckett, you'd better be ready to finish what you start. Beckett yanked his arm free, his smile twisting into something darker. Oh, I plan to... McCade. You just wait. The two men stood locked in a silent standoff for a long moment before Beckett finally turned and walked away, his boots echoing against the wooden steps. Jackson watched him go, knowing this was only the beginning. The wind that swept across the plains always carried with it the scent of something ancient, something that reminded a man of the past, of the choices he made, and the weight of those choices carried long after the dust had settled. In the evenings, when the sky turned the color of dying embers, there was a stillness, a quiet that wrapped itself around the land like a shroud, as though the earth itself was remembering things that had been buried beneath its surface. The ghost of a life that had once been. The sound of boots slowly fading into the distance. The last breath of a hard-earned victory. All lingered like the whisper of a forgotten song. There was a sadness in it, a bittersweetness that you could taste on the air, like the memory of a loved one long gone, whose name you could almost recall, but couldn't quite speak aloud. That was the way of things in places like Red Hollow, in the places where the past had a way of clinging, holding on tight, refusing to let go, even when the world around it moved on. For Jackson McCade, the journey he had started had brought him to this quiet moment in time, a moment where he could feel the weight of his decisions, the long road he'd traveled, and the people he'd met along the way. Their faces etched in his memory, their voices still echoing in the corners of his mind. Clara Belle Thornton, the woman who had once stood alone in the rain, had become something more than just a figure in his past. She was a reminder of the strength that could bloom in the harshest of places, the kind of strength that kept the light burning even when the world seemed to have forgotten how to keep it. And her boys, the ones who had once been little more than shadows in her wake, now had their place in the world, their own path to walk, their own stories to write. Jackson had learned more than he had ever hoped for, more than he had ever expected, and in those quiet hours, in the spaces between words, he realized that redemption wasn't something you could buy or force into being. It was something that had to be earned, day by day, with every choice you made, with every piece of your soul you were willing to offer up in the name of something bigger than yourself. That's what the West had always been. Wasn't it a place where the land could break a man? But it could also teach him how to stand tall, how to hold his ground when the storm came. And in the end, as Jackson stood beside the barn, the last rays of twilight falling across the barren land, he realized that it was never just about fighting for the family you had. It was about fighting for the family you could become. Honor could be buried beneath the weight of old mistakes, beneath the dust of lost battles, but it could never be erased. It could be forgotten, pushed aside, hidden in the shadows of the past. But somewhere in the quiet, in the space between breaths, it always lingered, like the soft rustle of wildflowers growing in the cracks of the earth. Justice, too, was a stubborn thing. It didn't come in the way you imagined, and it sure as hell didn't come easy, but it had a way of showing up when you least expected it. It might not come on your terms, and it might not come when you thought you deserved it. But in the end, it came. Even when the world turned a blind eye, even when it felt like nothing would ever be right again, there was always a chance for things to be set right. Clara Belle Thornton's story had been one of survival, one of forgotten promises and unspoken words. But in the end, it was a story of redemption, of a woman who had been cast aside, left to fend for herself, and yet had saved the very thing that would carry on the legacy of kindness and love in a world that often forgot such things existed. And the truth, well, the truth was something that could never be erased, no matter how much people tried to bury it. The truth didn't need anyone to believe in it, to give it life. It just needed one person to keep it, to hold it close, and never let go. Sometimes, the smallest act of belief could move mountains, could change everything. It didn't matter how dark the night was or how cold the winds blew. If you held on, if you stood firm, the world would eventually turn in your favor. As the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, Jackson McCade stood frozen. From the far ridge, a plume of smoke was rising his barn. Whatever peace they had found was over. Something or someone was coming for them. A family, a place, a future. A future that had been built on the quiet strength of a woman who never gave up, and the unspoken promises that had been made under the vast, unforgiving sky. It had taken time. It had taken pain. It had taken more than he ever thought he could give. But now, in the silence of the morning, as the wind whispered through the trees, he knew that what they had was real. And in the quiet, in the peace that followed the storm, Jackson McCade finally understood that redemption wasn't found in the things you left behind. It was found in the things you chose to carry forward. If you still believe in the power of honor, the quiet strength of the forgotten, and the truth that always finds its way to the light, then let it be known. If you believe that even the smallest act of kindness can change the world, then leave your mark, your sign, and join us. Type 1 if you believe in the legacy of the West, in stories that echo in the hearts of those who still care for them. Join us in this journey. Let the Western Story Chronicles be the place where the old stories live on, where redemption finds its home. For those who still believe that love, honor, and truth matter in this world. We'll meet you by the firelight,